The honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
So what we have here, besides interruptions, is the issue that the Liberals don't want to talk about, which is why they're not doing anything about the oligopolistic economy, which includes the fees that Canadians pay for their banking services, and those fees in particular around a company called Interac. It's on the back of your card, and Interac is an association, but it's basically owned by the four big banks, RBC, CIBC, Scotiabank, TD, and then the fifth one, Desjardins. They own it. And what they do is they charge a fee for any time you move money around. They do about 19 million transactions a day in Canada, but one of those issues is moving your own money to somebody else, an e-transfer. And in that, you'll be shocked to learn, I'm sure, that the two companies that chair the board of Interac, which are RBC and TD, get a preferential rate over all other financial services companies. They only charge themselves or get charged themselves 6 cents a cost for that, while they charge smaller and smaller financial institutions, particularly those not part of the Interac board, almost 44 to 46 cents per transaction. And that's huge. Understand that there's a $1.50 charge on each end on that. It's a $3 charge technically if you don't keep a minimum balance in your account. You get a $3 charge from the banks. RBC, TD, and the big guys are only paying 6 cents for that transaction, so they're making a 98% gross margin. And if you're a small credit union and not part of the government-protected oligopoly of Interac, which has basically a complete monopoly on the movement of money in Canada, then you're out of luck and you're paying 44 to 46 cents to the big banks for this service that own Interac. And that's why we're here, because we had witnesses in committee that would refuse to table any of their fee structures, even though they're a protected government business. We had witnesses that came before the committee in the credit card study as well on the issue of what's called the interchange fee. This government made a big announcement. We're reducing the fees. We're reducing the fees that small businesses have to pay to credit card companies for every transaction. It's usually a percent, somewhere between 1% to 2.9% of the transaction. If you pay with your credit card fee, that small business has to pay to the big banks and the Visa card companies. And there are companies that are the pipe, the plumber of the system that do that. And one of them is called Stripe. Another one's called Moneris. Some may have heard of Moneris. They've agreed to the fee cut, the voluntary fee cut that the government asked. But this company called Stripe decided, no, we're not going to. And they said, oh, no, it's because we're being charged a new GST fee and we can't afford it. It actually is a GST fee that they were paying all along, but only because of a court action was it delayed for 12 months. But they use that as an excuse either because they're greedy or they're just not as efficient as the other providers of that service. You be the judge of which one it is. But one of the interesting things is the person on the board of Stripe, which is one of the biggest companies in the world at doing this, is Mark Carney, who is the special advisor to the Prime Minister on the economy. He's the boss above the Minister of Finance. Then he's the next Liberal leader. This is the same fellow who's on the board of a company called Brookfield, who has just decided to move the entire company from Toronto to New York to avoid paying Canadian taxes. So while Mr. Carney preaches that Canadians should pay more for everything with a carbon tax, because carbon tax, Carney loves the carbon tax and thinks it should be 61 cents a litre, he moves all his business interests to the U.S. and he avoids the things that the Department of Finance is trying to do. This is the character of an individual who aspires to be Prime Minister of Canada, supposedly, but thinks it's better for the companies that he sits on the board of to dodge Canadian taxes and move to the U.S. and pay lower taxes. I don't know why carbon tax Carney wants to help the newly elected President Trump by moving his head office to New York. Apparently he admires him more than he admires the current Prime Minister. He wouldn't be doing this. So why is it that these Liberals continue to filibuster in committee to stop these examinations from happening? The parliamentary secretary for the Minister of Industry has done nothing but filibuster every time we bring up a motion to bring either carbon tax Carney or disclose the financials of MasterCard or disclose the financials of Stripe, which carbon tax Carney's on the board of. And he doesn't have the guts to vote against it. He just keeps talking. and talking and talking and stopping from getting to a vote. So that's the reason we're in this situation now in the House, where we have to use the power of the majority of this House to try and get that study done, because the parliamentary secretary is too afraid of having this debate in committee. And it makes you wonder what it is that that individual is trying to cover up for the government in terms of preventing these studies from happening. And, you know, we had one of the banking executives from RBC, who is co-chair of Interac and sits on their board, before committee. And one of our members asked him a number of times if he knew the fees of the company he's on the board of, that he represents his bank, that his bank actually owns, called Interac. And he said, I don't know the fees. Now, I've served on boards, private boards and Crown boards. I always knew what the fees were that the businesses I was on the board of. So it defied believability that this senior banking executive in Canada would not even know the fees that he charges or gets charged on Interac. And this is the kind of obfuscation that we see happening on this credit card study that has prompted this motion. In fact, all the banking heads were before the committee, and we asked them, look, I don't want you to betray your confidential commercial stuff, but you all judge yourselves publicly on something called return on equity. That's how much profit a year the company makes per share that shareholders own. And the companies overall, banks overall, are anywhere from a 10 to 15% return on equity. That means for a $10 share, they make $1 to $1.50 in profit a year, in that case, if it were 10 to 15%. We said, well, will you share that, what your credit card business is? What do you make in your credit card business? As a percentage, not the overall revenue numbers or not your expenses, just share that percentage like you do on your overall business. That's all confidential. Of course it's confidential. Some of you may know that I used to work for a bank at one time, a long time ago. I had hair then. And when I worked for the bank on Bay Street, that bank had a return on equity of 52%. Some might call that loansharking, but that's the level of return they get. That's why they don't want to do it. That's why this government doesn't want to do it. We had finance officials in industry committee this morning, and asked them, did they know those numbers on credit card business? They said they never asked. We had the senior finance officials in committee this morning and said, have you ever looked at the anti-competitive pricing of Interac and what they do between the owners, RBC, TD, Scotia, and CIBC, and what they give themselves as a cut rate versus all the other financial institutions? They said, no, we've never looked at it. I said, doesn't the Minister of Finance care about competitive behavior in the industry that she regulates? And they said, well, we don't look at it. That's somebody else's job. That's the Competition Bureau's job. Not my job to look at policy and decide whether or not the industry we regulate is competitive or not. I asked the same question about these great interchange fees and carbon tax Carney's company, Stripe, that's refusing to abide by the Minister of Finance's order. And do you look at anti-competitive behavior of the interchange fees? So not our job, not our job. We're just the government, nothing to see here. We're just the Department of Finance and the Minister of Finance. We're not concerned with competition. So that's the reason why we have an oligopolistic economy. You have a Minister of Finance and a Liberal government and a Department of Finance that doesn't care about the fact that we have an oligopolistic cell phone industry. We don't have a government that cares about the fact that we have a monopoly in banking, telecommunications, and airlines. It's incredible the extent to which this government goes to protect their corporate buddies.
It's my duty to